In 2015, here at Kelsey Creek Farm, we decided to start a vertical garden experiment. We'd been studying different kinds of vertical gardens and were impressed with many of the designs that we found available for purchase or to build. Among those are garden towers, which can be purchased, strawberry towers, garden barrels. There are also a number of do-it-yourself systems that can be built, including those that are shelves and are built out of pallets. Some can be hung on walls and act as individual plant containers and are actually quite beautiful. There are many styles available for those who decide to grow up instead of out. Our environmental conditions are important for those that want to emulate vertical gardening. We live in Northeast Texas, which is borderline zone 7B, 8A, and we have cool, wet winters and mild, wet springs with hot and dry summers. We wanted to construct a vertical garden that we could build ourselves that would have contact with the ground and that we could also use to compost kitchen scraps. We have come to appreciate self-composting gardens, and the ground contact was important for allowing the transfer of bacteria and worms, earthworms, and also cause some problems for us later on, which I'll explain. We started out with the idea of a three-sided shelf. Now each shelf unit is 4 feet tall. It has 9 growing spaces. It's built out, the sides are built out of 2x4s. The shelves are built out of 2x6 set on a 45-degree angle, with the bottom of one shelf equal to the top of the next shelf. Three-sided, we thought, would give us perhaps a little bit better exposure, and after some thought we decided instead to go ahead with a 4-sided shelf. We just added one more. The shelf really takes up about 9 square feet and encompasses about 27 linear feet of growing space. We set the shelf unit in our garden on some cardboard in a sunny spot of our garden. We oriented the unit so one side faced each compass direction, north, south, east, and west. We acquired the amount of material that we calculated would be needed to fill, and what we thought would be the best to fill our vertical garden. Before filling, we set the garden tower on cardboard just to suppress the weeds directly under the garden tower, and made sure it was level in all directions. We then filled the garden tower with the soil and added a composting bin on top, which is nothing more than a livestock mineral tub with the entire bottom cut out and holes drilled in the top to allow for aeration. The first planting was just in green beans as an experiment to see whether or not this new contraption would work. And throughout the growing season, we added garden and kitchen scraps into the top composting unit. The composting aspect of the garden tower works very well in that the garden scraps are composted And in general, plants grew really well in the garden tower. The beans grew, we had a good bean harvest, and later on in the fall we added green onions and radishes and lettuce, which also grew well for us. The radishes, although growing well, if allowed to get too large, were a little bit difficult to get out of the garden tower because they would expand larger than the spacing allowed. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Green onions did very well, had a real good crop of green onions. And overall, we're thinking that this was going to work out to be a fun way for people who had limited space to grow lots of vegetables in a small space, as well as compost all of their garden and kitchen scraps. We planted a fall crop of green beans, had a good crop of green beans, and the following spring followed that up with more radishes and onions, and just basically continued to plant and compost scraps in our vertical garden. The following spring, we planted the tower in strawberries and added 4 tubs at each corner, one filled with rosemary, one filled with garlic, one filled with leeks, and one filled with walking onions. As the year progressed, the strawberries grew. We had a good strawberry crop from the garden tower. The nutrients that flowed through the garden tower helped to fertilize the ground around the garden tower, providing a good harvest of garlic and parsley and leeks, as in green leeks, and the rosemary also grew very well. Throughout the year, though, we noticed that the composting efficiency of the garden tower was one that, although all of the food waste was predominantly converted to vermicompost, it didn't do a very good job of killing seeds. And I let these seeds grow. We wound up with cucumbers and tomatoes growing in the garden tower, which all grew very vigorously. While the volunteers grew very vigorously, it was becoming obvious that we were having a problem with keeping our strawberry plants alive. And there are several factors that contributed to the demise of the strawberry plants. Number one is that as we filled the garden tower completely with organic material, as the organic material decomposed, the level of the garden tower was continuously sinking. Overall, in the years now that we have been conducting this experiment, we have probably replenished the volume of the garden tower at least 4 times, as far as having to continuously add material. Organic material reduces at a rate of 10 to 1. So every 10 pounds of organic material eventually winds up being reduced to 1 pound of organic matter. And eventually, if not refilled, the entire volume would be reduced by a factor of 10. Some strawberries did survive, and we went on to just continue growing tomatoes and basically whatever sprang up in the tower garden, just to see how it was going to grow. The following year, we once again planted green beans. We used the garden tower as a platform for early spring spinach plants before we transplanted the spinach plants in other parts of the garden. And although many crops grew well, we were plagued by another problem, which was rodent problems. Mice found the garden tower very inviting. The garden tower basically turned into a mouse motel, and so there were mouse tunnels and undermining of soil that caused significant crop loss, although the overall composting effect, or I should say vermicomposting effect, was probably enhanced by the activity of the rodents living in the the vertical tower. You can see the size for those of the green bean leaves as the plants that did survive continue to grow very well and prosper. It's just that overall we weren't getting, for the 27 linear feet, we weren't getting the production that we should have been had we been growing this in a more conventional method. We planted the tower in peas, and the peas did very well. I think this can be attributed to the maturity of the soil in the garden tower starting to kind of settle down, compact a little bit. We weren't having the compaction rates, and we wound up with an excellent pea harvest, and the fertility of the entire area surrounding the garden tower was increasing dramatically, as is indicated by the growth of the rosemary and the garlic, and just in general, the effect for about 6 to 10 feet in all directions around the garden tower, we noticed the soil increasing. Here you can see the peas and the garlic and the rosemary and just how lush and green and the number of blossoms. So it really creates a very fertile gardening space. Following the green beans, following the peas, we planted green beans. We had a good crop of green beans this time. Once again, I believe this is due to the maturity of the organic matter in the tower. The organic matter is predominantly the result of continuing to add kitchen scraps. Whatever we had left over in the kitchen, from orange peels to leftover bread to tea bags, coffee grounds, eggshells, we would put in the composting bin, and through either earthworms or the larvae of black soldier flies, that organic material would be reduced very quickly and resulted in very fertile growing conditions and conditions that were very good for the worm population as well. My overall conclusions are that while vertical towers can save a lot of space, having a tower in contact with the ground presents some unique issues, especially in our case with rodents. But the composting action the vermicomposting action is remarkable. It was a fun experiment. We're going to continue, and I'd recommend vertical gardening to anyone.